I drove 12 long hours for my daughter's engagement dinner, my heart filled with pride and excitement, ready to celebrate the future I had worked so hard to give her. When I arrived, exhausted yet overjoyed, she looked me in the eye and said, "Oh, we had it yesterday." In that instant, the world I thought I knew shifted, and I realized nothing would ever be the same. What I chose to do after her words is something no one could have predicted. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. The highway stretched endlessly before me during that drive, but I did not complain. Every mile I put behind me brought me closer to what I believed would be a celebration of love, a reward for all the years of hardship. I thought about my daughter constantly. I pictured her smile, the way she used to reach for my hand when she was small, the sound of her laugh echoing through the house when her mother was still alive. I remembered the day I promised her, as I stood in the cemetery saying goodbye to my wife, that I would raise her the best I could and never let her feel unloved. That promise carried me through years of sacrifice. The road was long, and fatigue pressed on me, but excitement outweighed it. I did not mind my aching back or the steady hum of my old pickup truck. I sang along to the radio. I replayed old memories in my head, and I imagined how proud she would be to see me there. To me, this dinner was not simply about celebrating her engagement. It was about witnessing the fruit of my labor, about seeing her step into a new life surrounded by people who loved her. By the time I pulled into the city, the lights felt like stars scattered across the horizon. My heart pounded as I parked near the restaurant she had mentioned weeks ago. I straightened my shirt, ran a hand through my hair, and walked inside with a smile that came from the deepest part of me. The restaurant was warm and alive with chatter. Couples laughed over wine, and waiters carried trays that smelled of spices and roasted meats. I expected to see a long table decorated with flowers, my daughter beaming, her fiancé at her side, and friends raising glasses in celebration. What I saw instead was my daughter standing near the entrance, her arms crossed, her eyes darting nervously to the side. I stepped forward, ready to embrace her, ready to tell her how proud I was. But before I could say a word, she spoke. "Oh, we had it yesterday." The words hit me harder than the 12-hour drive. My smile faltered, my body froze. I stared at her, waiting for the laugh that would follow, waiting for her to say she was joking, that she had saved a seat for me, that I had misunderstood. But her lips stayed pressed together, her eyes dropped to the floor, and there was no correction, no hug, no warmth, just the cold truth that they had gone on without me. I felt a chill rise inside me as the room seemed to grow silent. Every sound of cutlery and laughter around us faded as I tried to make sense of what she had just said. My daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders when she was little, the young woman whose every dream I had funded, had chosen not to include me in her most important night. The exhaustion of the drive settled heavily in my bones, but the pain in my chest was heavier still. I stood there, gripping the strap of my bag, searching her face for any sign of regret, any explanation that could soften the blow. She gave me none. I had been many things for her: provider, protector, teacher, comforter. I had thought those roles would guarantee me a place at her side forever. In that moment, I realized how wrong I had been. And as the truth sank in, another realization grew quietly inside me. They believed this was the end of my story. They believed I would walk away defeated. They believed wrong. The drive stretched before me like an endless ribbon of asphalt, and though my body grew heavier with each passing hour, my heart carried me forward with a sense of purpose that made the fatigue bearable. Because this was not just any trip. This was the journey of a father who had poured his entire life into his only daughter and who now believed he was about to witness the reward for every sacrifice he had ever made. And as the miles rolled beneath the wheels of my old pickup truck, I found myself reflecting on the decades that had led me here, decades filled with nights where I worked until my bones ached, mornings where I rose before the sun, and countless moments when I set aside my own needs in order to make sure she never lacked for anything. And as the sun climbed higher and painted the sky with streaks of orange and gold, I imagined her smile waiting for me at the end of the road, and that thought alone was enough to fuel me through the monotony of the highway. I remembered the nights when she was just a little girl, and I would sit beside her bed after coming home from work, my clothes smelling of sweat and oil, my hands rough from labor, but still gentle as I brushed the hair from her forehead and kissed her good night. And I thought about how many times I whispered promises to her that I would never let her down, that I would always be there, no matter how tired I was. And now here I was, keeping that promise, pushing through 12 long hours on the road, because her happiness was still the brightest star in my sky. Every landmark I passed seemed to pull a memory from me, like the sight of a family gathered at a roadside diner that made me recall how she and I once shared greasy fries and cherry pie on a trip to visit her grandmother, or the sound of laughter from kids playing outside a gas station that reminded me of her younger days when she would chase fireflies in the backyard and then run to me with her tiny hands cupped around their glow. And each of these memories became fuel for the journey, reminding me that love could carry a man further than any engine ever could. My truck rattled whenever I climbed above 60, the steering wheel vibrating in my hands, but instead of worrying about the noise or the age of the vehicle, I smiled at it, because that old truck had been my companion through years of labor and years of rebuilding, and in its resilience I saw myself still moving forward, still determined to reach the finish line of this particular race. I stopped only when I absolutely had to, stretching my legs at lonely rest areas where vending machines hummed and fluorescent lights flickered, but even then, I did not linger, because I could almost feel the warmth of the celebration waiting for me. The joy of seeing my daughter's face lit with pride and happiness, and that vision pulled me back behind the wheel every time. The longer I drove, the more my thoughts deepened, and I began to realize that this trip was more than just a physical journey. It was a reflection of the life I had lived, a road paved with endurance, love, sacrifice, and a belief that at the end of struggle, there would be reward. And so I pushed on, mile after mile, heart swelling with the anticipation of being part of her special night. The signs along the highway counted down the distance to her city, and with each one I felt the weight of my exhaustion pressing against the lightness of my excitement. But I refused to let weariness win, because this night would be worth every ache in my back, every droop in my eyelids, and every stiff movement of my hands on the steering wheel. And by the time I saw the skyline rise against the fading light, I was filled with a sense of triumph, believing that I had made it through the trial of the road just as I had made it through the trials of life, and that very soon I would step into a room where my daughter would look at me with gratitude and love, and I would know with certainty that every mile had mattered. When I think back on the years that shaped both my daughter's life and my own, I see a story written in long nights and quiet mornings, in sacrifices made without hesitation, and in the unwavering belief that she deserved a better future than the one I had been given. And it all began the day I lost my wife, the day I stood in a small cemetery with the weight of grief pressing on my shoulders and the fragile hand of a 12-year-old girl clutching mine, her tear-stained face buried in my chest as I whispered over and over that I would take care of her, that I would never let her feel alone, that I would somehow fill the space her mother had left behind. And from that moment forward, every choice I made, every hour I worked, and every dream I set aside was dedicated to keeping that promise. In those first years, I worked jobs that pushed my body to its limits, shifts that bled into one another until I could barely tell night from day, standing on factory floors, lifting heavy boxes, cleaning offices when most people were asleep, and though my hands grew rough and my back carried a permanent ache, I never complained. Because each paycheck meant food on the table, clothes on her back, and tuition for a school that would give her opportunities I never had. There were times when I sat at the kitchen table staring at bills spread out before me, exhaustion pulling at my eyelids, and I would wonder how I was going to manage it all. But then I would hear her laugh from the other room, light and sweet, and the sound would give me the strength to pick up the pen, write another check, and push forward. I remember how she would leave little notes on the fridge, crayon-scribbled drawings of us together, stick figures with smiles too big for their faces, and those childish sketches became my trophies. Reminders that even if I was failing myself, I was not failing her. When she entered high school, I took on even more work, driving delivery trucks on weekends and repairing roofs in the summer heat, because I knew she would one day need money for college, and I was determined to provide it, no matter how much of my own comfort or health it cost me. I skipped vacations, I skipped new clothes, I skipped any thought of saving for myself, because every dollar saved was a dollar that could go toward her dreams, and every sacrifice I made seemed worth it whenever I saw her standing on stage holding an award, or when I opened letters from schools praising her dedication. She grew into a young woman with intelligence and grace, and though I often worried that she did not see how much it cost me to keep everything together, I never wanted her to feel that burden, because I believed it was my duty as her father to carry it quietly. I lived in a small, modest home, kept old furniture, and repaired everything instead of replacing it, while she had the books, clothes, and trips that helped her keep pace with her friends. And when she finally received her acceptance letter to college, I sat at the kitchen table with tears in my eyes, not from fear of how I would pay for it, but from pride that she had made it, because I knew I would find a way. I mortgaged the house, drained savings, and worked extra hours to cover her tuition, never once regretting the choice, because watching her step into that new world made me feel as though I had kept my promise to her mother. And in those moments, I told myself that all the sleepless nights and sore muscles were worth it, that one day she would look back and understand what it had taken, and she would love me all the more for it. As the years moved forward, the role of provider became the very identity that defined me, because no matter how many times I told myself that she was grown now and capable of standing on her own feet, I could never silence the voice inside me that reminded me she had once been a little girl who depended on me for everything. And so, even as she stepped into adulthood, I continued to shoulder the weight of her world without hesitation, paying bills that were not mine, buying necessities I would never use, and watching my savings shrink in order to keep her life steady and comfortable. And I did it all with pride, because I believed it was what a father was supposed to do. I can recall the day she called me about needing help with her rent when her first job after college did not stretch far enough, and without a second thought I wired the money, telling myself it was only temporary, that soon she would be secure, and I would no longer need to step in. But 1 month became 2, and then 2 became 6, and soon it felt natural for me to keep covering the shortfall while she built her life without the stress of bills dragging her down. When her old car broke down, it was me who dipped into what little I had put aside to make sure she had reliable transportation, because I told myself she needed it for work and safety, and so I signed the check and smiled when she drove off, never letting her see how much of a dent it made in my account. When her wedding was announced, I was the one who offered to help with the deposit on the venue, my chest swelling with pride as I told her not to worry about the cost, because even though I was inching toward retirement and knew that every dollar mattered more now than ever, I believed that this was my role and that her joy was worth more than my comfort. I still remember standing in the jewelry store, watching her fiancé choose a ring that sparkled under the lights, a ring that I later learned was paid for in part by money that had come from me, tucked into his hand discreetly, because I wanted my daughter to wear something worthy of her beauty, and in that moment I thought only of her happiness, not of whether it was fair for me to carry that burden. Groceries, electricity, small loans that were never repaid, larger loans that were never even called loans but simply disappeared into their household. I provided it all without keeping count, because in my heart I believed that family did not tally debts. Family gave freely, and a father especially should give without question. Yet as I look back, I realize I was not only sustaining her life, I was sustaining the image she and her fiancé projected to the world, an image of stability, success, and comfort that was in truth propped up by my invisible hand. And though I did not resent it at the time, I cannot deny that deep down I hoped for gratitude, for acknowledgement, for a moment when she would look at me and say she understood just how much I had sacrificed to keep her world turning. Instead, I kept giving, telling myself that one day when the time came, she would repay me not in money but in love, in loyalty, and in the bond we had built together, and that belief kept me going. Even when I felt the weight of every dollar I spent, pressing against the limits of what I had left for myself. It was somewhere along the way, after the steady rhythm of giving had become second nature, that I began to notice the small cracks forming in the way my daughter and her fiancé treated me, cracks that at first I brushed aside as youthful pride or harmless oversight, but which slowly grew sharper with each passing year, leaving me with a gnawing unease. I tried desperately to ignore because I did not want to believe that all my sacrifices had created something other than gratitude, and yet the signs became harder to miss, like the way her fiancé spoke to me during family gatherings with a tone just slightly edged in superiority, as though he thought himself more accomplished, more refined, and more deserving of respect than the man who had quietly financed so much of the life they enjoyed. I remember one dinner where he boasted about a business deal he had supposedly closed, leaning back in his chair with a grin while my daughter nodded proudly, and when I congratulated him with genuine warmth, he smirked and said something about how money makes money, a phrase that might have seemed harmless to anyone else, but which cut into me because I knew he was using my money and my sacrifices as the springboard for his bravado, though of course I held my tongue because the last thing I wanted was to embarrass my daughter or make her feel caught in the middle. She too began to change in subtle ways, answering my calls with less enthusiasm, cutting our conversation shorter, and sometimes avoiding direct questions about finances or responsibilities, and I told myself that it was only because she was busy, that she was caught up in her new life and the whirlwind of adulthood, but deep down I could feel the distance growing, a space between us that had not existed when it was just her and me against the world. At holidays, when I would bring small gifts or cook meals from scratch, she would thank me politely but with a distracted air, her eyes always flicking toward him as though waiting for his approval, and sometimes I wondered if the bond we once shared was slowly being rewritten by his influence, reshaped into something where I was no longer the foundation of her life, but merely a supporting character whose role was to provide when asked and stay silent otherwise. There were times when I caught him making jokes at my expense, little comments about how old-fashioned I was, how I did not understand the modern world, and though I laughed along to keep the peace, inside I felt a sting. Not because I cared about being outdated, but because I could see my daughter laughing too, and it hurt to realize that she found amusement in belittling the man who had given her everything. Yet even then, I clung to the belief that this was temporary, that once they matured, and once the responsibilities of marriage settled on their shoulders, they would come to appreciate the foundation I had built beneath them. So I convinced myself to be patient, to let the cracks heal themselves, to trust that love would override arrogance. I wanted so badly to believe in her goodness, in the bond we had shared for so long, that I allowed myself to minimize the warning signs, telling myself that every generation struggles to understand the one before it, that perhaps I was simply being sensitive, and that it was my duty as her father to keep supporting her until she was fully established. What I did not realize at the time was that these cracks were not healing. They were widening, and every act of dismissal, every careless word, and every quiet smirk was slowly building toward something I could not yet see, something that would one day confront me with the truth I had tried so hard to deny, that my role in their lives was not the honored place I imagined, but a convenience they felt entitled to exploit, and that knowledge, once it finally revealed itself in full, would change everything. By the time I finally saw the familiar signs of the city where my daughter now lived, my body was stiff from the long drive and my eyes burned from the strain of keeping them open through the endless stretches of highway. But none of that mattered, because I was filled with a swelling sense of anticipation that drowned out every ache, and as I pulled off the freeway and into the streets, I could feel my heart thudding with excitement, telling myself that soon I would see her face again, that soon I would be part of a moment that would shine in my memory as proof that all the years of sacrifice had led somewhere meaningful. I parked the old pickup truck near the restaurant she had mentioned weeks earlier, brushing my hand along the dashboard as if to thank the vehicle for carrying me the distance without complaint. Then I reached into the small bag beside me and pulled out the shirt I had pressed carefully the night before, slipping it on over my shoulders with hands that trembled more from nerves than from exhaustion. I checked my reflection in the side mirror, smoothing down my hair and tightening my tie, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to imagine the look on her face when she saw me, how her eyes would widen with joy, and how she would run into my arms, because in my mind that was the only outcome that made sense after everything we had been through together. The streets outside the restaurant were busy with couples walking hand in hand, with groups laughing as they headed inside for their own celebrations, and as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt a surge of pride that I, too, was about to step into such a moment of joy. The restaurant glowed warmly under soft lights, its windows polished to a shine, its doors opening and closing as servers carried trays of steaming plates and families embraced at the entrance. And I thought to myself that this was exactly the kind of place my daughter deserved, a place that mirrored the elegance and comfort I had always wanted her to enjoy. I straightened my posture as I walked through the entrance, holding my head high despite the stiffness in my back, because I wanted to look strong for her. I wanted her to see not a tired old man, but the father who had always stood behind her and who had driven 12 hours just to share in her happiness. Inside, the air smelled of roasted meats and herbs, the clink of glasses, and the low hum of conversation filling the space with warmth. And for a moment I let myself breathe it in, telling myself that this was the reward, that I had finally arrived at the celebration that would mark the beginning of her new life. I scanned the room eagerly, searching for her face, expecting to find a long table decorated with flowers and filled with laughter, and I imagined myself slipping quietly into a seat, raising a glass, and hearing her say how glad she was that I had come. The hostess looked at me curiously when I asked about the reservation, flipping through her book as though the name I gave her did not exist, and just as confusion began to settle over me, I spotted her in the distance, standing a little behind her fiancé, her dress catching the light in a way that made her look every bit as radiant as the little girl I remembered. Yet her eyes did not shine with joy. They darted away from mine as if she were caught in something she could not explain. My heart leapt in my chest, ready to burst with relief that I had found her, that I had made it in time, and I stepped forward with arms half raised, a smile breaking across my tired face, certain that I was about to be welcomed into the moment I had dreamed of for so many miles. When I finally closed the distance between us, my heart pounding with the joy of reunion and the weight of 12 hours of anticipation, I expected the warmth of my daughter's embrace, the sparkle of gratitude in her eyes, and the simple confirmation that every sacrifice I had made had led me to this moment. But instead, what I encountered was something that would etch itself into my memory with the sharpness of a blade, because as I stood before her, smiling through my exhaustion, I opened my mouth to say how proud I was. Yet before I could form the words, she looked at me, her lips pressed together in hesitation, and then she spoke in a voice that was soft, but carried enough weight to silence the roar of the restaurant around us. And what she said was, "Oh, we had it yesterday." At first, my mind refused to process the meaning, as though her words were in a language I had never heard before. Because how could it be possible that the engagement dinner I had driven so far to attend had already taken place without me? How could it be that my daughter, the child I had raised with every ounce of my strength and love, had allowed such a moment to pass without her father by her side? And yet the expression on her face told me everything, because there was no laughter, no playful correction, no gesture that suggested it was a mistake or a poorly timed joke. There was only silence and the unbearable weight of truth. Her fiancé stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his eyes glinting with a satisfaction that felt almost rehearsed, and though he did not speak, the smirk that curled the corner of his lips was louder than any words, telling me that he was not surprised by what she had said, telling me that he had perhaps even encouraged it. I stood frozen, gripping the strap of my bag with fingers that felt suddenly too weak to hold on, and I searched my daughter's eyes for an explanation, for a sign of regret, for any flicker of the little girl who once clung to my hand when she was afraid. But she turned her gaze away, as if she could not bear to meet mine, and that avoidance cut deeper than the words themselves. The clatter of dishes, the laughter of strangers, and the gentle music of the restaurant all faded into a dull hum as my focus narrowed to the two faces in front of me, one indifferent and smug, the other ashamed and complicit. And in that instant I felt the long miles I had driven settle into my chest like stones, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to demand how it was possible that a father who had given everything could be excluded from the celebration of his only daughter's engagement, but my throat closed up, my voice lost to the storm of disbelief and pain swirling inside me, and so I remained silent, letting the moment stretch into eternity. For a fleeting second, I wondered if the other guests in the restaurant could see what was happening, if they could sense the cruelty of the dismissal, but they carried on with their meals, oblivious to the quiet unraveling of a bond that had once seemed unbreakable. My mind replayed her words again and again, each repetition striking harder than the last, until I felt a strange calm beginning to settle over me, the kind of calm that comes not from acceptance, but from the realization that something fundamental has shifted and cannot be undone. And as I stood there in that silence, my heart still aching, but my expression carefully controlled, I understood that this moment would define everything that came next, because what they saw as a dismissal, I would one day turn into a reckoning. The moment those words left her lips, the world around me seemed to collapse inward, not in noise or fury, but in a suffocating silence that pressed against my chest with more force than the 12 hours of road I had just endured, because as I stood there staring at my daughter, the same girl I had carried in my arms when she was too small to walk, the same young woman I had sacrificed my youth to support, I realized that in her eyes I no longer held the place I believed was mine, and that realization was like watching the foundation of a house crumble after years of careful building. I felt the exhaustion of the journey finally seep into my bones, but it was not just the fatigue of driving that weighed me down. It was the fatigue of decades of sacrifice suddenly revealed as invisible, as though the nights I worked with bleeding hands and the mornings I rose before the sun were erased with a single sentence. My smile faltered and slipped away, and though I tried to keep my composure in the middle of that bustling restaurant, my heart cracked in a way I had never experienced. Because this was not the pain of disappointment or misunderstanding. This was the pain of knowing that the one person I thought would always honor me had chosen to turn her back. The sound of her fiancé clearing his throat beside her jolted me out of my daze, and when I looked at him, I saw nothing but smugness, a quiet triumph in his eyes, as though he had orchestrated this humiliation. And though I wanted to confront him, I held myself still, not out of weakness, but because my mind was racing faster than my lips could form words. I turned back to her, silently pleading for some gesture, some small flicker of remorse that might tell me she regretted what she had said, but all she did was glance down, her shoulders stiff, her silence more devastating than any spoken explanation. And in that silence, I heard every sacrifice I had made echo back at me as though mocking me for believing they had meaning. My body remained motionless, but my thoughts spiraled through memories of the countless times I had gone without so she could have more, of the birthdays I had worked through so she could blow out candles on cakes I could barely afford, of the years I had lived modestly so she could grow without fear. And as I stood there with the weight of betrayal pressing into my chest, I realized that to her these moments were not stones in a foundation, but simply shadows that she could walk away from. The shattering was not loud or violent. It was quiet and final, like glass breaking in slow motion, pieces scattering in ways that could never be gathered again. And while on the surface I remained calm, inside I was unraveling. My identity as father, provider, and protector being stripped away by the daughter I thought would always see me as her anchor. I could not hear the music of the restaurant anymore. I could not taste the air that moments ago had been rich with the aroma of spices and roasted meats. All I could feel was the hollowness settling inside me. And yet beneath that hollowness, something else began to stir. Something colder and steadier than the raw hurt. A realization that if I mattered so little to her in this moment, then perhaps I had given too much power away, and perhaps it was time to take it back. That thought was small and quiet, barely more than a whisper in my mind, but it was enough to steady me, to keep me from collapsing under the weight of her words. And as I stood there staring at her lowered gaze, I knew this was not the end of the story. Because while she believed I would walk away defeated, she did not yet understand that this moment of shattering was also the moment of awakening, and one day soon she would. After standing in that restaurant, with her words still echoing in my ears, I left quietly, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. And though my body felt hollow with shock, my mind sharpened with a clarity that comes only when the heart has been pushed beyond its limits. So I walked slowly down the street, telling myself I needed air, telling myself I needed time to understand what had just happened. But fate has a way of placing truth in your path when you least expect it, and that was exactly what happened next. Because, as I lingered near the corner of the building, still gathering my breath, I caught the sound of their voices drifting through the open window above where they had seated themselves. Voices that were low, but carried clearly enough for me to hear every word. And those words became the final hammer against the fragile hope I had been clinging to. I heard my daughter's fiancé first, his tone sharp with mockery, saying that it had been the right choice not to invite me because I would have embarrassed them with my old-fashioned ways, saying that I did not belong in their circle of friends, saying that I was more of a burden than a blessing. And though the cruelty of his voice cut deeply, it was the next voice that pierced me most. The voice of my daughter, the same voice that once begged me to stay by her bedside when she was frightened of thunderstorms, now softened with agreement as she whispered that it was better this way, that she did not want her friends to see me, that she was tired of people thinking she had grown up with nothing because of how simple and modest I appeared. And in that moment, I felt something inside me collapse entirely, not because they had insulted me, but because I realized they had excluded me on purpose, deliberately, with thought and calculation, not by accident or oversight. My heart clenched as I listened to them laugh lightly about how I still sent money, about how I would always be there to cover what they could not. And I understood then that they saw me not as a father or a man worthy of respect, but as a tool, a resource, a wallet they could open whenever they wished. And that revelation struck me harder than the 12-hour drive or even the words she had spoken at the door. For a long moment I stood frozen, my hand pressed against the cool brick of the building, my eyes closing as if by shutting out the sight of the world I could shut out the sound of their betrayal. But the words remained, replaying themselves in my head with merciless clarity, reminding me of every instance when I had doubted myself, when I had questioned whether I was giving too much, and showing me now that my instincts had been right all along. Yet, even in that crushing moment, something else began to grow inside me, something stronger than despair, because as painful as it was to hear the truth, it was also liberating, for I no longer had to wonder if their actions were mistakes or misunderstandings. I no longer had to excuse the distance between us as the natural course of life. I could see with absolute certainty who they had become, and in that certainty lay the seed of my resolve. I took a slow breath and stepped away from the building, my heart still raw, but my mind colder and clearer than it had been in years. And as I walked into the night, I knew that the man they mocked as pitiful and old-fashioned would not remain silent forever. For while they believed they had written me out of their story, they did not yet realize that I was about to write the chapter that would change everything. As I walked away from that restaurant with the echo of their laughter and their careless words still burning in my ears, I felt a strange calm begin to settle over me. A calm that was not born of peace, but of clarity. Because in that instant I understood with perfect sharpness that the years of sacrifice, the decades of sleepless nights, the endless hours of toil had not bound them to me with gratitude, as I had always believed, but had instead created a dependency that they had twisted into entitlement. And if they could so easily mock me, exclude me, and speak of me as though I were nothing more than a tool to be used, then it was time for me to remind them of who I truly was, and of what I was capable of when pushed to the edge. I did not feel the fire of rage that so many might expect. I did not feel the urge to storm back inside and shout the truth into their smug faces, because rage is loud and fleeting. But what took root inside me that night was something colder, steadier, and far more dangerous. The kind of resolve that comes only when a man has been underestimated for far too long and finally sees the moment to turn the tide. As I moved through the streets, past the neon signs and the strangers who hurried by without knowing the storm that was gathering within me, I replayed the countless moments when I had held my tongue, when I had written checks instead of asking questions, when I had offered support instead of demanding accountability, and I realized that it was not weakness that had guided me but love. And yet now that love had been exploited to the point where it no longer bound us together but instead threatened to consume me if I let it continue unchecked. So I made a choice in that quiet walk back to my truck, a choice that did not need shouting or grand declarations, a choice that existed only in the steady beating of my heart and the sharpening of my thoughts. And that choice was simple. I would no longer be their victim. They thought me pitiful. They thought me outdated. They thought me incapable of protecting myself or asserting my worth, but they had forgotten that every dollar in their pockets, every roof over their heads, and every comfort they enjoyed had been built by my hands and sustained by my sacrifices. And that gave me a kind of power they could not begin to imagine. I sat in the cab of my truck for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, breathing in the familiar scent of worn leather and dust, and in that silence I began to sketch the outlines of a plan, not of revenge born from cruelty, but of justice born from truth. A plan that would remind them that a father is not to be discarded when inconvenient, that a man who has given everything is not to be mocked as though he were nothing, and that respect, once lost, can never again be bought with borrowed smiles. My heart no longer raced with the hurt of betrayal. Instead, it beat with the steady rhythm of determination, and as the city lights blurred around me, I whispered quietly to myself that they had underestimated the wrong man. The resolve I carried that night was not the kind that burned out in anger. It was the kind that grew stronger with each thought, each memory, and each step forward, and I knew that from that moment on, every action I took would be deliberate, every move I made would be measured, and in the end, they would understand the cost of their choices. When I returned home after that long and painful journey, I sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by the familiar walls that had borne witness to my life of sacrifice. And I let the stillness settle around me as I began to gather the pieces of everything I had given, everything I had built, and everything I still controlled, because while my daughter and her fiancé believed they had cut me down to nothing, they had forgotten that the life they were living was one carefully constructed from the bricks I had laid one by one. And in the solitude of my home, I started to piece together not only the memories of what I had provided, but the tangible proof of how deep my influence still ran. I pulled out drawers filled with old bank statements, letters, and receipts, and as I spread them across the table, the truth unfolded in front of me like a map, showing every sacrifice I had made and every contribution I had provided to sustain them. There were tuition checks I had written when she first entered college, amounts so large they had required me to mortgage my house again. Yet I had done it gladly, because I believed her education would be the legacy I left behind. There were transfers to her account for rent and groceries during those years when her paychecks had not been enough, small amounts that had added up to thousands, but I had never reminded her of them because, to me, it was simply the duty of a father. Then came the larger commitments, the deposits for her wedding venue, the quiet loans to cover the debts her fiancé had accumulated but never admitted to anyone, The money slipped discreetly into their hands to help them appear successful in front of friends, and each one stood out now like a thread in the fabric of their lives, a thread that originated from me. As I examined the piles, I began to see not just sacrifice but leverage, because every paper on that table told a story, and that story was one of dependency, not independence. And I realized that for all their arrogance, they had been standing on ground I had built and continued to hold steady. It was a revelation that changed the tone of my grief, because I no longer felt like a man discarded without recourse. I felt like a man who had been underestimated and who now saw the opportunity to remind them of the truth. I spent hours cataloging everything, marking dates and amounts, creating a timeline of sacrifice that stretched across decades. And with each entry I wrote down, my resolve grew stronger, because I knew that these records were more than just numbers on a page. They were proof that I had not been irrelevant, proof that I had been the foundation of everything they claimed as their own. When fatigue finally overtook me and I leaned back in my chair, I no longer felt hollow. I felt sharp and focused, like a blade honed after years of wear. And I understood that this gathering of pieces was the beginning of something far larger, a plan that would not only reclaim my dignity, but also force them to confront the truth they had tried so hard to deny. In the quiet of that night, as I stared at the papers spread across the table, I whispered a silent promise to myself that I would no longer allow my sacrifices to be hidden or forgotten, and that very soon they would learn what it means when a man who has given everything finally decides to take it back. Once I had gathered all the records of what I had given over the years, I knew that the next step could not be taken alone, because while my resolve was strong, I also understood that precision and legitimacy would be the keys to making every move count. So I began reaching out quietly to the kinds of people who make their living turning chaos into order and turning injustice into accountability, professionals who could guide me in ways I had never needed before. I started with a lawyer, a man recommended by an old friend I trusted, someone with a reputation for being sharp, measured, and relentless in protecting the interests of his clients. And when I laid the stack of papers on his desk, detailing every tuition check, every rent payment, every loan and transfer that had kept my daughter and her fiancé afloat, I saw his eyes narrow with interest, because he did not see the story of an old man clinging to memories. He saw a case built on decades of undeniable evidence. He told me plainly that what I had provided was far more than generosity, that it established a financial pattern, and that in the eyes of the law and in the world of contracts, these patterns could be leveraged in ways that might strip away the illusions my daughter and her fiancé had built around themselves. From there, I contacted a financial advisor, a younger woman whose energy and precision impressed me, and I showed her not only the records of my support, but also the assets I still held quietly in my name, assets that I had never boasted about, but which I had kept secure for my retirement, and she explained to me that I was in a far stronger position than I realized, that if I chose to pull my support and restructure the small trust I had once created for my daughter, their carefully curated image of wealth would unravel quickly. Sitting across from these professionals, I felt something I had not felt in a long time, a validation that my sacrifices had not been invisible after all, because here were people who could look at the black and white evidence and confirm that I had carried a weight far greater than any father should have to carry alone, and that my choices now would have consequences they could not avoid. What struck me most was the way they both treated me, not as a weary old man, but as a client with power and options, and that recognition was like a spark in my chest, reminding me that I had been underestimated for too long. With their help, I began to outline the framework of what I would do, steps that would be slow, deliberate, and undeniable, steps that would pull back the curtain on the truth and reveal to everyone exactly how dependent my daughter and her fiancé had been on the man they mocked and dismissed. We spoke of contracts, of the potential to reclaim funds disguised as loans, of withdrawing support in ways that were both legal and final. And with each new detail, I felt the quiet fire inside me burn stronger, not with rage but with determination. By the time I left those meetings, carrying folders neatly organized with strategies and timelines, I knew that I was no longer alone in this, that I had allies who would stand with me, professionals who respected not only the evidence I had provided, but the resolve that had driven me to act. And as I walked back to my truck under the fading light of the afternoon, I told myself that this was the beginning of their lesson, that the same man they thought powerless was now armed with knowledge, strategy, and support, and that very soon they would discover just how dangerous it is to mistake patience for weakness. With the guidance of the lawyer and the financial advisor, I began to take the first steps in a plan that had grown sharper with each sleepless night, and though my hands trembled as I signed the papers and made the calls, it was not with fear, but with the weight of finally reclaiming control over a life that had been drained by entitlement for far too long. And the first string I cut was the trust fund I had quietly established years earlier for my daughter, a fund meant to ensure her future security, but which had been tapped prematurely and misused to support the lifestyle she and her fiancé paraded so proudly. I walked into the bank with folders under my arm and instructions from my lawyer in my mind, and when I sat with the manager and explained my intent to restructure the account, to pull back what had been given and to close off access to what remained, I felt a sense of finality settle in my chest, because this was not an act of cruelty but of clarity, a way of reminding myself that generosity without respect is not love but self-destruction. From there, I halted the monthly transfers I had been making to cover their rent and utilities, transfers that had become so routine that I no longer even thought of them as gifts, but as obligations. And when the advisor helped me draft the notice to their landlord, redirecting all future communication to them alone, I could almost hear the ripple of confusion that would follow when they realized the cushion they had always assumed would never vanish was suddenly gone. I reviewed the loans I had extended, informal agreements written in my own handwriting, and with the lawyer's guidance, I began formal proceedings to reclaim what I could, not because I needed the money, though my retirement account would certainly be healthier for it, but because the very act of demanding repayment forced into the open the truth they had worked so hard to conceal, that their independence had been an illusion built on my sacrifices. Each string I cut felt like a breath drawn deeper into my lungs, like shedding a weight I had carried on my shoulders for decades, and though I imagined their shock, their arguments, their attempts to twist the narrative, I knew that none of it mattered anymore, because I was no longer giving without question. I was no longer financing their charade. In the quiet of my home, I crossed off each step of the plan, as though I were a craftsman building something new out of old timber, and what I was building was not revenge alone, but freedom, the freedom to live the years I had left without being shackled to the demands of people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. I thought of my wife often in those days, of the promise I had made at her graveside to protect our daughter and to give her every chance at happiness. And I knew that what I was doing now was not a betrayal of that promise, but a fulfillment of it, in a way I had not understood before, because true love is not enabling selfishness. True love is teaching accountability. And though it tore at my heart to take these steps, I knew it was the only path left. By the time the last letter was mailed and the final account closed, I sat back at my table surrounded by neat stacks of papers, and for the first time in many years I felt as though I had reclaimed not just my finances but my dignity, because every string I had cut had not weakened me, it had strengthened me, and the man who had once been mocked as powerless was now holding the scissors with steady hands, ready for whatever came next. Once the strings had been cut, and the flow of money that had silently carried them for years came to a sudden halt, I did not rush to confront them, nor did I announce what I had done, because I knew that silence would speak louder than any declaration, and so I waited, watching carefully from a distance as the life they had built on foundations I had poured began to shift beneath their feet, and what I saw confirmed every suspicion that had grown in me during those long nights of planning. At first, the changes were subtle, almost invisible to anyone outside their circle, but to me, a man who knew every detail of what it cost to maintain their lifestyle, those changes were as loud as thunder. I noticed through mutual acquaintances that the dinners out at expensive restaurants began to lessen. The social media posts that once flaunted lavish meals and sparkling nights started to slow, and then quietly disappeared. I heard whispers that bills were piling up, that her fiancé had grown irritable and short-tempered, lashing out when he realized the safety net he had relied on was no longer there. And though my heart ached to think of my daughter caught in the middle of his temper, I forced myself to remember that she had chosen this path with him. She had chosen to look away when I stood at that restaurant door humiliated, and now she was choosing to live with the consequences of building her life on someone else's labor. The landlord, who had once spoken to me directly, now spoke only to them, and when rent deadlines passed, late notices began to arrive, and with each one my silence grew heavier, because I could have stepped in, I could have saved them again, but I had promised myself that those days were finished, that the man who gave endlessly, without question, was gone. In the quiet of my home, I would sometimes sit with a cup of coffee and think about them, not with bitterness, but with a kind of cold curiosity, wondering how long it would take for them to realize that the world they thought was theirs had only ever existed because of me. I heard from friends who lived nearby that their car, the one I had once helped purchase, was no longer in the driveway, and it did not take much to guess that it had been repossessed when payments slipped too far behind. Their friends, who had once gathered around them for parties funded indirectly by my sacrifices, began to drift away, no longer charmed by the illusion of stability and success, and the circle that had seemed so full around them grew smaller until it was nearly gone. I observed all this without a word, without an intervention, because I knew that if I stepped in now, if I softened the edges of their fall, then everything I had endured, every ounce of humiliation, every cold realization of their betrayal would have been for nothing. My silence was not cruelty. It was a mirror, a reflection of what life truly looked like when propped-up illusions were stripped away. And though it hurt to imagine my daughter struggling, it also brought me a strange sense of peace to know that at last she would see clearly who had been holding her up all along. In those days, I felt myself grow stronger, steadier, not only because I had reclaimed my independence, but because I had chosen to observe rather than to rescue. And with each passing week, the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming grew wider, until I no longer recognized the man who had once been so quick to give. I had become something else entirely, a man who could sit in silence and watch without flinching, knowing that every consequence unfolding before them was the direct result of choices they had made, and knowing that my role now was not to catch them, but to stand firm and let them fall. It was during this period of silence, as I allowed the cracks in their carefully constructed life to spread without interference, that the truth I had suspected began to rise to the surface, and with it came the confirmation that my daughter's fiancé had not only been ungrateful but had been actively exploiting me, boasting about it in circles he thought would never reach my ears. And yet secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks when arrogance blinds the keeper. A friend of mine, an old colleague who still moved in certain business circles, approached me one afternoon with a look of discomfort, saying he had overheard conversations that I deserved to know about, and as he recounted the words, I felt both anger and vindication settle into me like two sides of the same coin. He told me that the fiancé had bragged openly to acquaintances, speaking with pride about how he had managed to secure everything without lifting much of a finger, boasting that the house they rented, the car they drove, the trips they flaunted, and even the ring on my daughter's finger had all been made possible by what he mockingly referred to as my bottomless wallet. And as my friend repeated these words to me, I felt the sting of them, but also the clarity, because here was the proof I had always known must exist, the evidence of the arrogance and entitlement I had long suspected. He had not only used me, he had celebrated it, turned my sacrifices into his trophies, and laughed about how easy it was to keep me giving by playing the role of dutiful fiancé. My daughter's part in these conversations was quieter, but no less painful, for I was told she would sometimes sit silently by his side, not contradicting him, not defending me, and on some occasions, even smiling faintly as if acknowledging that what he said was true, and that silence was its own betrayal, because her refusal to correct him was as loud as his mockery. I began to piece together more through contacts who reached out quietly, people who had seen the way he carried himself, puffed with pride about how he had an older man financing his dreams, and every word that returned to me became another nail in the coffin of the illusion they had built. I kept detailed notes, recording dates, names, and the specific things that had been said, and as I did so, I realized that the plan forming around me was not just about reclaiming what was mine, but about stripping away the facade they had so carefully polished for the world. Their friends, once dazzled by their lifestyle, began to see the truth as whispers spread, and slowly the admiration they had cultivated turned into suspicion, then into gossip, and finally into quiet distance, because no one wants to stand close to those who are revealed to be frauds. For me, it was both painful and liberating to witness this unraveling, because while it hurt to know that my daughter had been complicit, even if by silence, it also gave me the strength to move forward with even more determination. For I understood now that their downfall would not only come from the cutting of my financial strings, but from the exposure of their secrets to the very people whose opinions they valued most. I did not need to speak loudly or confront them directly at this stage. All I needed to do was let the truth circulate, let their own arrogance betray them, and watch as the same mouths that once praised them began to question, doubt, and eventually turn away. The exposure of secrets is often more powerful than any confrontation, because when people are unmasked by their own words, there is no argument that can shield them. And as I sat in the quiet of my home recording these revelations, I felt a steady calm fill me, knowing that the tide had turned and that the reckoning I had promised myself was already underway. When the time finally came for me to step out of the shadows of observation and silence, I knew I had to do it with care, because this was not simply about a father confronting his daughter, or a man facing down an arrogant fiancé. This was about creating a moment where the truth would no longer be something whispered in private or hidden behind polite smiles, but something undeniable, revealed in a setting where they could not twist it or laugh it away. And so I sent an invitation. I worded it carefully, choosing language that sounded generous and familiar, telling them I wanted to sit down together to discuss the future, to talk about what lay ahead, and perhaps even to go over the wedding plans. I wrote the message as though I were once again the dependable father, ready with advice and resources, and when I pressed send, I imagined their faces lighting up with smug certainty that I had come to my senses, that I was about to place yet another offering at their feet, and that expectation was exactly what I needed. In truth, I had already arranged everything behind the scenes. The location I chose was not a restaurant or a private home, but a quiet office space rented for the evening, with a long polished table and chairs waiting for us. I invited my lawyer and my financial advisor to be present as well, framing their attendance to my daughter and her fiancé as simply professionals there to help formalize some details, and I knew that their presence would give the meeting a weight that neither of them could ignore. The night of the meeting, I arrived early, placing folders neatly on the table, each one filled with documents, receipts, and statements that told the story of my sacrifices in black and white. And as I sat in that chair waiting for the sound of their footsteps, I felt the same calm resolve that had carried me through the weeks of preparation. When they walked in, their faces carried the expressions I had expected, smug and expectant, my daughter glancing at me with an uneasy kind of relief, as though she believed I had returned to my old role, and her fiancé smiling, with the confidence of a man certain that he was about to be handed yet another check. I greeted them with warmth, keeping my voice measured and calm, because I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them blind to what was coming until it unfolded around them. I gestured for them to sit, and when they did, I began to speak about the importance of family, about the years of sacrifice, and about the future they were stepping into. They nodded politely, almost impatiently, waiting for the moment when I would reach for my wallet or present them with something they could use, but instead I slid the first folder across the table. My lawyer began to speak then, his voice firm and authoritative, laying out the timeline of my financial support, every payment, every loan, every deposit, and as page after page was placed in front of them, their expressions shifted from smug certainty to confusion and then to unease. I watched in silence, my hands folded, my gaze steady, because this was not about shouting or gloating. It was about letting the truth speak for itself. And as my advisor explained how the support had now been cut off, how the assets had been secured, and how repayment would be pursued, I saw my daughter's face pale, her fiancé's jaw tighten, and the weight of reality begin to sink in. This was the confrontation I had planned, not in anger, not in noise, but in undeniable evidence and steady resolve. And though I said little, the silence I maintained was its own declaration, because they could no longer deny what was laid before them. The air in the room grew heavier with every page that slid across the table, and though I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, nothing could quite compare to the sight of their faces as the carefully guarded illusion of independence and success began to crumble right in front of them, because for the first time they were confronted not with my patience or silence, but with the cold, undeniable truth of what I had provided and how deeply they had depended on me. My lawyer's voice filled the space with precision, reciting figures, dates, and amounts like a drumbeat, and each number struck against their composure like a hammer. The engagement ring, partially funded by my savings, the deposits on the venue that bore my name on the check, The monthly transfers that had been labeled as loans in my records but treated as gifts by them, all laid out in detail, until the story they had spun for their friends and for themselves unraveled line by line. I watched as my daughter's fiancé leaned back in his chair, his confident smirk replaced by tight-lipped silence, his eyes flicking to the lawyer as though searching for an opening to argue. But there was none, because the evidence was too thorough, too clear, and too devastating. My daughter, on the other hand, could not meet my eyes. Her head bowed, her fingers nervously twisting at the edge of her sleeve, and I felt a pang in my heart at the sight of her shame. Yet I knew that this was a necessary reckoning, one that could not be avoided any longer. When the financial advisor spoke, her words carried an even deeper weight, explaining how the accounts had been restructured, how the transfers had been stopped, and how the assets that had once cushioned their every decision were now secured beyond their reach. And with every sentence, I saw the realization dawning in their expressions that the life they had lived so carelessly was no longer sustainable. Finally, when the professionals had laid out everything, I leaned forward, folding my hands on the table, and I spoke for the first time with a calmness that surprised even me. I told them that I had given more than most fathers ever could, that I had sacrificed my health, my time, and my peace to make sure my daughter had every opportunity, but that generosity had been twisted into expectation, gratitude had been replaced by entitlement, and respect had been shattered by mockery. My voice did not rise, it did not tremble, it simply carried the weight of truth. And I told them plainly that from this moment forward I would no longer be their safety net, that they would have to stand on their own 2 feet without leaning on me, and that every debt left behind would be pursued until it was settled. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of my daughter's uneven breathing and the way her fiancé's fists clenched against the table. And in that silence, I felt the culmination of years of sacrifice finally find its balance. This was the grand reveal, not of anger, but of truth, a stripping away of illusions until all that remained was the reality they had tried to bury, and though it tore at me to see my daughter's tears, I knew that she needed to see this. She needed to understand the cost of what she had chosen. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence linger, and I saw in their faces the dawning recognition that the man they had dismissed, the father they had underestimated, had just rewritten the story they thought they controlled, and from this moment forward nothing would ever be the same. In the days and weeks that followed that meeting, the ripple effect of what had been revealed spread faster than even I anticipated, and I watched from a deliberate distance as the facade my daughter and her fiancé had so carefully crafted began to unravel piece by piece, until all that remained was the truth they had worked so hard to bury. The first signs were subtle, whispered conversations among their friends who had once admired their lifestyle, people who began to question how 2 young individuals with modest jobs could have afforded the dinners, the trips, the designer clothes, and the ring that had dazzled everyone. And when the whispers met the evidence that had been placed so neatly on that table during our meeting, suspicion turned into certainty, and admiration shifted into judgment. Their landlord, who had always received timely payments before, began to press harder when rent fell behind, and without the quiet cushion of my transfers, those notices piled up until neighbors could see the eviction warnings taped to the door. The car, once polished and parked prominently in their driveway, was repossessed in full view of others on their street, and the shame of that moment clung to them like a second skin. Friends who had once flocked to their parties grew distant, uncomfortable with the knowledge that so much of what they had believed was a lie, and invitations to gatherings dried up until they were left sitting in the silence of their home, no longer admired, but quietly pitied. For my daughter, the collapse was etched across her face, the brightness in her eyes dimmed by the weight of realizing that the world now saw her differently, not as the accomplished young woman she wanted to be, but as someone exposed by her own choices. For her fiancé, the collapse revealed itself in his temper, his voice rising behind closed doors, his arrogance faltering as he realized that the very man he had mocked had stripped away the foundation of his comfort. And I heard from neighbors and acquaintances that his confidence had turned to bitterness, his words sharper, his demeanor more desperate as his pride crumbled. I remained silent throughout it all, never stepping forward to add to their humiliation, because I did not need to. The truth was already doing the work for me, and I understood that their greatest punishment was not my anger, but the reality of living without the safety net they had so long taken for granted. I would sit at my table in the evenings, sipping my coffee, reading the news, and thinking about how fragile their empire of entitlement had been, how quickly it had collapsed once the strings were cut. And though a part of me ached for my daughter, for the little girl she had once been, I knew that this collapse was necessary, that only by facing the consequences of their choices could they ever hope to learn what I had tried to teach her all along, that respect and gratitude are worth more than wealth and appearances. As the weeks stretched into months, the collapse deepened, and I heard that they were forced to downsize, leaving behind the home they could no longer afford, moving into a smaller place with fewer comforts, and the friends who had once surrounded them were nowhere to be found. Their fall was not just financial, it was social, emotional, and deeply personal, and though it pained me to think of my daughter living through it, I reminded myself that it was not my cruelty that brought them here, but their own choices, their own betrayal, and their own arrogance. Watching their collapse was not easy, but it was the consequence of years of entitlement finally meeting the truth. And as much as it hurt, I also felt a deep sense of closure, because I had reclaimed my dignity and my freedom, and they were left to live with the reality they had created. As I sat alone in the quiet of my home, weeks after their world had begun to collapse, I found myself breathing differently, more deeply, as though a weight I had carried for decades had finally lifted from my shoulders. And it was in that stillness that I discovered something I had not felt in years, a peace that came not from their downfall, but from my own liberation. Because, for the first time, I was living without the chains of obligation that had defined my every decision since the day my wife passed away and left me with the responsibility of raising our daughter on my own. I had always believed that my sacrifices were necessary, that my worth as a father was measured by how much I could give and how little I kept for myself. But now, after the long journey through betrayal, humiliation, and resolve, I realized that my worth had never been tied to the checks I wrote or the bills I paid. It was in the love I gave, in the promises I kept, and in the resilience I had carried through years of hardship, and no one could take that from me, not even my own daughter. Sitting by the window with a cup of coffee warming my hands, I watched the sun rise over the horizon, and for the first time in many years, I did not think about what I needed to send to her, what bill needed to be covered, or what crisis needed my attention. I thought only about myself, about the life I still had to live, and about the peace that came with finally putting myself first. I realized that I had been a victim not because they had betrayed me, but because I had allowed myself to be drained without demanding respect in return. And once I took that power back, once I cut the strings that tied me to their entitlement, I was no longer a victim, but a man who had survived, endured, and reclaimed his dignity. My evenings became quieter, but they were filled with a new kind of contentment, reading books I had long put aside, tending to the garden that had been neglected while I worked long hours, and even reconnecting with old friends who had watched from a distance as I sacrificed everything for my daughter. Friends who now welcomed me back into their company, not as the weary man they once pitied, but as someone who had rediscovered himself. In those moments I often thought of my wife, of the promise I had made to her as I stood at her grave with our young daughter clinging to my hand, and I asked myself whether I had kept that promise, and though part of me mourned the way things had turned out, I also knew that I had fulfilled it in every way that mattered, for I had raised our daughter, given her opportunities, and loved her without limits. And now it was no longer my burden if she chose to turn away from the lessons embedded in those sacrifices. I had done my part, and the peace I felt was not born of bitterness but of completion, the quiet acceptance that my story as her provider had reached its end, and that my story as a man who could finally live for himself had just begun. I found joy in small things again, in the sound of birds outside my window, in the taste of a meal I cooked for no one but myself, in the freedom of knowing that my time and my resources were mine alone to spend, and though the scars of betrayal would always remain, they no longer controlled me. They were reminders of what I had endured and what I had overcome, and in that peace I found strength to know that the years ahead would not be defined by loss, but by the quiet dignity of a man who had given everything and finally chosen to keep something for himself. In the final stretch of this journey, as I looked back on everything that had unfolded, I realized that vindication is not a loud victory or a dramatic scene of triumph. It is the quiet assurance that the truth has spoken for itself, and the people who once underestimated you can no longer deny it. And that was exactly what I carried with me in the weeks and months that followed the collapse of my daughter and her fiancé's carefully crafted facade. The consequences of their choices had unfolded swiftly and publicly, stripping away the admiration they once basked in and leaving them to face the world without the protection of the man they had so carelessly dismissed. And though I did not rejoice in their suffering, I felt a deep sense of balance return, because for the first time in years the scales no longer tipped against me. I had lived through betrayal. I had endured humiliation. I had been treated as though my sacrifices were meaningless, and yet here I stood, not broken but stronger, with my dignity restored and my independence secured. Vindication came in knowing that every person who once admired their lifestyle now understood that it had been built on the back of a father's labor, that the success they flaunted had never been theirs to claim, and that the man they mocked was the one who had carried them all along. Closure came not in words exchanged or apologies offered, but in the silence that followed, the silence of their distance from me, the silence of their absence in my life, and in that silence I found freedom. I no longer woke in the morning wondering what bill I might need to cover or what crisis might demand my help. I woke with the clarity that my life was my own, that my remaining years could be spent on my own terms, with my own choices, and with my own peace. I found myself walking more slowly through my days, savoring the moments I had once overlooked, the warmth of sunlight on my face, the comfort of familiar streets, the laughter of old friends who had always respected me for who I was rather than what I could give. I knew that my daughter now lived with the consequences of her decisions, that she would one day have to face the truth of what she had lost. And though it pained me to imagine her in regret, I also knew that her growth, if it ever came, could only be born from the lessons life was now teaching her, not from my hand reaching out once again to shield her. Vindication for me was not about punishing them. It was about reclaiming myself, about proving to them, to others, and most importantly to myself, that I was not the powerless figure they imagined, but a man with strength, resolve, and dignity. Closure was the final act of letting go, of no longer carrying the weight of their choices, of stepping out of the shadow of sacrifice and into the light of my own freedom. And in that closure I found a peace more profound than I had ever expected. As I sat one evening with the sun setting outside my window, casting the sky in colors of gold and crimson, I whispered a quiet thank you to my wife, telling her that I had kept my promise, that I had raised our daughter, given her everything, and stood firm when the time came to protect my own dignity. And though the ending was not the one I once dreamed of, it was an ending that carried strength, truth, and freedom. And so I close this chapter with no bitterness, only the quiet triumph of a man who gave everything, endured betrayal, reclaimed his power, and finally chose to live for himself. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.